I am an African.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Whichever part of the world you're listening to us from, we understand our viewership is pretty widespread, and we thank you for that. We didn't know our coverage would be that wide. Today, we're going to be talking about something incredibly interesting, and we have a very incredibly interesting guest as well. We're going to be talking about Mugabe's Zimbabwe and the aftermath. Mugabe is a very controversial figure. Some people love him, some people hate him. He's well known across the borders of Zimbabwe and Africa. So today we're joined by Dr. Chipo Dendere, a Zimbabwean national herself, and a lecturer and academic scholar at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, right? In Massachusetts in the United States of America. So welcome to the show, by the way, Africa for Dummies, aka A4D. Welcome to Africa for Dummies.
Thank you. That's actually a really cool name. I like it.
Yeah, actually, it was actually satirical. Even our logo is satirical. You know, for those, someone asked, why is our logo upside down, Africa? Basically trying to turn around all the complexities and demystify Africa. So you might have seen Africa in one way, you're going to leave seeing it in a different way. That's the message. So if we can just sort of get into it, starting with the Mugabe years, Zimbabwe was one of the last colonies to get independent. I think Namibia probably was the last one, but like from a European power. 1980, April 18th. Yep. Zimbabwe got independent, and the man Robert Gabriel Mugabe was the first prime minister who became president. So what brought Mugabe to that point? And I understand there was, prior to independence, there was a factional sort of fight for independence versus Joshua Nkomo, who was the head of another political liberation faction in the Zimbabwean War for Independence. So what brought Mugabe to that place?
Yeah, so, of course, I teach African politics, which and I always tell my students that the pre-independence politics in the region is just as important for understanding the post-colonial and post-independence dynamics of power. So ZANU, as we know it today, didn't exist before independence. In fact, Robert Mugabe and other academics, I like to think of it, were not on the active front lines. As you can imagine, a lot of the liberation struggle leaders had been arrested. So Robert Mugabe comes in after ZANU-PF is already, ZANU has split to ZAPU and ZANU. So initially you have ZAPU and then they split. Joshua Nkomo is leading one faction, Tongogara is leading another faction. Tongogara was set to become the president. He gets killed on a flight. Robert Mugabe gets brought in. And there are lots of different perspectives on, and of course, Zimbabweans listening to this will know that I have summarized in very loose details at least 10 years of history.
Now let's take a step back for a second. Before Zimbabwe was Zimbabwe, it was Rhodesia. Now, before Rhodesia was Rhodesia, it was Southern Rhodesia. From 1965 to 1979, Rhodesia existed. Now, how did it come about? In 1965, a guy called Ian Smith, who was a white nationalist leader at the time, decided, you know what, the wave of nationalism, black nationalism to be specific, and independence for black majority African states was just too much and too furious. Let's just break away from the British colony and create our own independent state. This became known as the Unilateral Declaration for Independence, the UDI, in 1965. So from 1965 to 1979, war broke out because, the white nationalists was much harder to deal with than the British Empire, which was a recognized entity. The independent state of Rhodesia was much too harder to deal with, and it wasn't even internationally recognized. So you had various factions in the black nationalist movement against Zimbabwe. Key to understanding what we've just discussed just now is ZANLA and ZANU. ZANLA was the military wing of ZANU. ZANLA stands for Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army. ZANU stands for Zimbabwe African National Union. So ZANLA is the military wing, and commanding that was Josiah Tongogara, and a rising star in the political establishment of ZANU was Robert Mugabe, who we will continue talking about in this episode. However, just to get a background on who Josiah Tongogara was and the politics of ZANU and ZANLA, Josiah Tongogara was the commander-in-chief and happened to have died just before the 1980 election, giving Mugabe a clean slate to lead ZANU into victory. Let's get back to the discussion.
But some will say that Robert Mugabe was brought in because as an intellectual, he was actually also a moderate. And whereas others had a lot of frontline experience, Robert Mugabe had the manner of being a diplomat, which was equally important for politics. If you watched, though, the messaging around the coup, that was quite interesting, as his peers were denouncing him and denouncing his role in the liberation struggle. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So Robert Mugabe comes in. Kenan Banana is the president at the time. And as I often tell my students, most African countries were likely to move from the parliamentary system to the presidential system. And there are many reasons for that. I mean, even starting off in Ghana, which is our oldest democracy on the region, if you will, in terms of having gained independence first. The reasons that are given are that, well, presidential system would allow for better peace management, but we know that it was really also about coalition of powers. The president has more power than parliament. I mean, you've just seen what's happened in England. You guys have changed leaders. I don't know, you're on your 10th leader of the year or something.
In 1 year.
In 1 year, yeah. And, because parliamentary systems do open themselves to that, right? Even on the continent, we look at South Africa is not quite as crazy as the UK, but as a prime minister, you can, or as a president in a parliamentary system, you can get kicked out without, as much fanfare as you would have in presidential systems. So Robert Mugabe comes in, he's pretty much a favorite, but there's also some serious issues, right? Because ZAPU and Joshua Nkomo was a very popular figure. There's the genocide that happens in 1983, something we don't talk a lot about in our history. But that sort of forces Gukurahundi. That forces Joshua Nkomo's hand. There's again a lot of differing opinions, not necessarily published literature, but I see a lot of value in the conversations that Zimbabweans have on social media, especially, in countries like ours, where for many, many reasons, people are more oral. And, so those oral conversations have been really enriching for me. So for some people, it was that Joshua Nkomo had no choice. The only way to stop the killings is you join hands. And then in 1986, you see the formation of ZANU-PF, which is this big umbrella party that we have today.
Just to interject, for our listeners, might have been a bit fast. So the ZANU-PF is the Zimbabwe African National Congress Union, and she said it became ZANU-PF after the consolidation. So that's the Zimbabwean African National Union Patriotic Front. And Joshua Nkomo was of ZIPRA, right?
ZAPU.
So ZAPU is a political wing. Yeah. So the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Union, Revolutionary Army, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I speak really fast.
No worries.
Kind of get into it, and Robert Mugabe is the darling of the world. He is invited to the White House. Jimmy Carter is president at the time. He's knighted. He's given many, many, many accolades, including honorary degrees by universities both on the continent and outside the continent. Back home, though, and I always have to question this because I was born in the latter part of the 80s. And if you were like me, and I think this is really important to qualify this because this wasn't the experience of everybody. But I do think that the majority of people did see their lives become better those first 10 years. But of course, this is not true for our counterparts in Matabeleland, right, whose families had been impacted by the genocide. It's also not necessarily true maybe for people in rural areas where poverty was much, much deeper because of colonial rule, and it would take a while. But in those first 10, 15 years, and I'm thinking of myself, starting first grade in the 90s, that there was a significant growing middle class, right? A kid could leave the rural area. I think of my parents, their friends. You could move from the rural areas and make a living, build a life, build a middle class life, build a working class life, if you will, for your family. But, a combination of, not actually a combination of, but I would say that the structural adjustment programs by the World Bank
The
really
liberalization
created,
and
yeah.
cutting
So
off public
so they
services.
create a mess, right, in the 1990s. This is something that I've been going back to think about. And their whole idea, when you spend time at the World Bank, it's that Zimbabwe was a democracy. It was setting the standard for the continent, and you wanted to restructure it as an example. But that was really costly because Zimbabwe had just newly gained independence. It wasn't ready to be restructured. It wasn't ready to have so many people kicked out of office. And at the same time, ZANU-PF is also consolidating power, right? So you've got other opposition leaders like Tekere, who had been part of ZANU-PF and kind of splinters out. He's running for office in 1992. He gets badly beaten. But it's also that even when ZANU-PF would have won, they still used levels of violence that were concerning. They still
So the elections were questionable then, even in
the elections were pretty good, but it's almost like you're going to win, and there's really no reason for you to go the extra mile of beating up your opponent because you are going to win. I was thinking of the first game of the World Cup, and I was like, "Whoa, do you guys need to keep going so hard? Like you've already beaten them. Like we get it. You don't need to keep going so hard, right?
Game over already. You don't have to.
Yeah, the game is over, right? And so I think ZANU-PF is always been sort of like the game is over, but we're still going to beat you because one is to prevent you from doing this again. And two, because why not, right? We want to establish dominance. But the reason I say that the politics wasn't entirely bad is because you also have people like Margaret Dongo, who's an independent woman who leaves ZANU-PF, is still able to maintain his seat. But by the time you get to the 90s, the economy is tanking really, really badly. I was in primary school in 1996. I was in 5th grade. And I remember there were so many protests. And, I had an aunt, and this is why this stands out to me. I had an aunt who didn't wear anything other than 6-inch heels. Wow. Like she was, she was like your poster child of post-independence life, just like living her best life
and everything.
Yeah, and so she came home. She was wearing tennis shoes, and we're all like, "She's wearing tennis shoes. What happened?" And she says she had to walk from town. And it's just funny because for her it's like, I wore tennis shoes, and the rest of us are like, "What happened?"
Yeah, and, it's like you're gauging the economy on what she's wearing.
Exactly, that's what we're doing. But it starts the spiral. These actions. Morgan Tsvangirai, who was the late Morgan Tsvangirai, who was leader of the opposition, and a very active trade unionists. So you get this coalitions once more. And what's also interesting for me is that in the late 1990s, white Zimbabweans who had made a pact with ZANU-PF that they would sort of keep the business end of things, and ZANU-PF would do the black politics side of things. They start to go back on that promise and thinking, well, maybe this is an opportunity to support a different party. And I think, when you talk to opposition people, many of them are not going to want to talk about this or to admit this. But at least this is what I was finding in my research and conversations with white activists at the time, white farmers who were now interested, like most people, I think. And, maybe there is an opportunity with MDC. Things were going really, really badly. The UK is also going back on their promise about land reform.
Lancaster House Agreement.
Yeah, so they're saying, the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, she was Irish, and she's saying, look, my country was colonized too. Do you see me getting any reparations? That type of stuff, right?
Yeah, it was the infamous clear short message.
Exactly.
So just background, the Lancaster House Agreement, we've sort of gone really fast. So the Lancaster House Agreement was, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it was an agreement basically on the terms of independence, that Britain will basically pay for the compensation to redistribute the land. And for our listeners, Zimbabwe was heavily, the land was heavily appropriated towards white people who were the ruling class for several years. And so that was a big issue. And Zimbabwe was at war for almost 10 years prior to independence, right?
Yes, Zimbabwe was in war for a long time. And one thing about the conditions of Lancaster, it was to stop the war, number one. It had become very clear that the Rhodesian army was losing. And so that was number one. So number one, the Rhodesian army was losing. So the Lancaster House is to stop the war. And then the other goal was to protect the land that was being used by white Zimbabweans. So white Zimbabweans were about, 3% of the population or something like that, maybe more, I don't know, but it doesn't matter because they had like 99% of the very fertile land. And
I read a book and it said the population of white Zimbabwe was more or less like a suburb, like a big suburb, more or less, like.
Yeah, and they owned the land, right? And it just wasn't owning the land. I mean, when you own the land, you own the means of wealth in a country like Zimbabwe, which was created by the British to some extent as an agriculture stronghold. I've been having my students read the advertisements that were put out when the British were trying to encourage people to settle in Zimbabwe, right? And so what they were looking for were people that had skill sets in agriculture. So the second part of the Lancaster Agreement was that there would be no land reform for the first 10 years after independence. So ideally, land reform should have begun in 1990. And in 1990, the British government should have paid some amount to facilitate that. But that didn't happen, right? So, and in a way, it's because ZANU-PF and white farmers come to this agreement. You guys are going to do the money side of things, and we're going to do the politics side of things. And it's this unwritten agreement. And it's also that if you're a white farmer, you had no reason to give up your land. I've interviewed a lot of white farmers. I interviewed one guy who said, why would I do that? Because I was saying to him, the government reached out multiple times asking if you guys would share some of your land. I mean,
that's the willing buyer, willing seller.
Willing buyer, willing seller. And they were not even asking for land that was being actively used, right? They were asking for the hundreds of acres of land that were not being used. And this guy says to me, look, Chipo, why would I do this? I could feed the entirety of Zimbabwe 3 healthy meals a day: breakfast, cereal, lunch, dinner, meat and a grain, whatever. He had, we're sitting there, he's got a helicopter pad. His wife would do all of her shopping in Italy.
Whoa.
Yeah, they didn't need, so their money was sort of in and out, right? And this is not to justify land reform, but I think it's also to give another context where people...
Yeah, there were inequalities that...
Exactly. And most Black Zimbabweans just aren't aware of how wealthy farmers were and how much land they had. And what actually struck me when I arrived at that farm is that, so you see the big Victorian house, right? That's usually white. Yeah. With
colonial era type of
families, and then you see these like shanty shacks where the workers live. It's like, my office would house 3 or 4 families.
Wow.
And there was no school. There was, and the guy is saying to me, well, I have a school, I have a clinic for my workers. And I go and look at the school. I was raised in a middle-class Black Zimbabwean family. So I go and look at the school, like, dude, this is the school that you are praising yourself for. Like, this is where 300 of your farm worker kids go to school. This is the clinic, right? But at the same time, ZANU-PF would not have started land reform the same way they did had it not been for the war veterans, right? In all of this conversation about land reform and people talking about Robert Mugabe as being, so to take us back to Robert Mugabe, who's the primary subject of your interest, people would talk about Robert Mugabe as having ignited land reform. It wasn't him. It was actually a war veteran named Gukurahundi.
Okay.
Hunzvi. And Gukurahundi is quite interesting because when the war veterans start demanding things, I mean, these are people that went to war, they were made promises. I mean, some of them clearly looked very young and didn't look like they had gone to war, but the majority of them were legitimate war veterans who were living in poverty, in squalor. Right. And so they're demanding things from the government. Initially, the government does the $50,000 payouts, which your readers might know that this is, or your listeners would know that this is what starts to tank the Zimbabwean economy. So 50,000 Zim dollars at the time was about $4,000 US. So they give out these payouts, and there are these really fascinating stories of people's grandfathers buying, like, they would like book 2 taxis, one taxi for himself and a taxi for his jacket, because they just got this payouts. So it was pretty insane. But then Chenjerai and the war veterans are like, this is not enough. We want more. So they start demanding land from the white farmers. There's this really iconic picture of a white woman and her dog, and these war veterans standing at the gate. What people don't realize is that those war veterans in the late 90s would get arrested multiple times by the Zimbabwean government. Right. But at some point, Robert Mugabe
by the independent Zimbabwean government.
By the independent Zimbabwean government.
So you have the political elite who, were commanding them to go to war. They get independence, and then they're like, hey, where's the land? And it's like, shh, quiet, let's behave, calm down. And so now they've sort of like, the spark has just lit, they've just had enough of.
Exactly. And we have to remember that Robert Mugabe himself had always been very committed to lawfulness. This is why even Zimbabwe's school, right? Zimbabweans are, in some ways, are very committed to like rules and regulations. I mean, it's this British colonial influence, but it's also, I think, very Zimbabwean, right? This idea of like following rules, even when the situation is insane. It's like, okay, we're having a coup, but we're trying to make this into the most constitutional, legally bound coup. Like, what is happening, right? And so I think that's what happens with the Chenjerai. And they had also started protesting in the urban area, in the city, and crushing things. And ZANU-PF is like, nope, we're not doing this. But at the same time, ZANU-PF is now left with like, look, there's white farmers, we can protect them, but they're going to support MDC.
Right.
And Ebonites, exactly, Ebonites are going to support MDC. So who do we have? We have the war veterans. And so land reform, and unfortunately, the rise of MDC, the first action is this constitutional vote. And MDC campaigns for the no vote, which made sense, right? It's like, we're going to oppose what ZANU-PF wants, because the no vote actually also gave more powers to the presidents in very convoluted ways.
Was this just a broad reform of the constitution, or was it?
It was a proposal for a written constitution.
Okay, right.
But one of the things that it did was to put into the constitutional land reform as a constitutionally protected process. The question is whether or not, if people had voted yes, there were enough bad things in the constitution to be worried.
Yeah.
But you almost have to want, and it's unclear that ZANU-PF would have held their end of the bargain. That's number one. Number two, it's also unclear that white farmers would have agreed to these terms, right? That weren't necessarily going to work for them. So just to say that in 2000, you spark off a really strong opposition. You also spark off ZANU-PF's desperation. That's why we've seen, since 2000, Zimbabwean politics has been pretty brutal. My own work focuses on emigration in London, which we think of as Harare, it's Harare South, Harare North, where... And
to be fair, Harare it wouldn't be out. I keep on telling people this, Harare wouldn't be out of place in an English setting. If you look at the basic infrastructure, very, very anglophone in construction and so on. So it's understandable that they'll call it Harare South.
Yeah, and also just the numbers, right? So you get, about a quarter of the population leaves the country. You start this massive decline in the economy. By the time we get to 2008, we've got the famous $1 trillion note that couldn't buy you anything.
Hyperinflation.
We've got hyperinflation. I remember when I arrived in college in 2005, they were saying every student had to pay the equivalent of $100. And there was an option to pay this $100 in your national currency. And so the lady is calculating how much I would need to pay in Zimbabwean dollars, right, at the time. This is 2005. And she says, you know what? this is not working. I think we just have to waive it for her. Because I was like, I could pay it in Zim dollars. I really couldn't. But I was like, I could pay it in Zim dollars. But it kept changing so much. And nobody really wanted Zim dollars. I mean, what was the school going to do with Zim dollars anyway? So you come to college. And so that's... But then then there's the tensions within ZANU-PF, you get the GNU, so we can sort of skip over that.
So what is the GNU? The GNU is Zimbabwe's Government of National Unity that was started as a result of a heavily disputed election in 2008. It was formed in February 2009. It composed the President Robert Mugabe and the leader of the opposition Morgan Tsvangirai of the Movement for Democratic Change, and various cabinet positions were given to senior ranking members of the MDC.
But also what happened...
The GNU was the unity government after the
2008
election. There was...
And let me just briefly mention that, because I think what's important about the period from the March 2008 election to the June 2008 election, that's the period that I mark as the rise of Grace Mugabe.
Let's take a seat back. Who is Grace Mugabe? Grace Mugabe was actually Mugabe's secretary, and they got married in 1996, a few years after Sally Mugabe, his first wife, who was a political activist in her own right, who died in 1992.
So you go from, I think my book would say something like, you go from Gucci Grace to Comrade Grace. And it's very clear in the way that she's dressing. So up until now, Grace Mugabe isn't really involved in politics. She doesn't speak at rallies. She doesn't do anything really politically. But the party needed her. The party realized something. So they start to build her up to campaign. I mean, you can literally see she stops wearing designer clothes to rallies. It doesn't mean she stops buying them. She just stops wearing them at rallies. And now she's got the beret, right? That becomes
an appearance
important, right? And so I think Grace goes along from the 2013 election, 2016, and you start to see a shift in her tone. Like, wait a minute, if I can do it for you guys, why can't I do it for myself?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I have campaigned so that we have a woman.
So the initial intention was never about her being president. It was just about mobilizing.
It was about mobilizing, and she could speak, right? She could rally the crowd. It doesn't matter what she's saying. Yeah. She could rally the crowd. Her husband is getting older and sicker, and she could do what he used to do, right? She's got the language for it. She's got the vibe. She's young. She's beautiful. She's all of these things. But I think in a way, the party didn't realize that they were creating somebody who is going to potentially take all of them down, right? And so there's a point in 2017 where she actually says, people say that I have presidential ambitions. I don't have presidential ambitions, but what would it be wrong if I had presidential ambitions? I'm also a citizen, right? She uses her voice to embarrass people, the George Tarambas of this world, the Emerson.
I think there's a famous clip, and we're now going almost to the downfall of Mugabe, but now she mentioned there was a famous clip where she said "Hakuna vacancy," which I think probably means there's no vacancy.
There's no vacancy. There's no vacancy. She's like, I'm not interested. But she's also, in the expulsion of Mnangagwa, which I think was engineered by Grace. And some people will say some of what Grace was saying was not entirely untrue. Right. We then realized that the factionalism in ZANU-PF was a lot deeper than people would have imagined. But I also think Emerson Mnangagwa got lucky. I don't think he was particularly the first choice for the generals, but that's a story for another time. And so Emerson Mnangagwa is fired at the behest of Grace, and she miscalculates, right? So Grace miscalculates her importance. She also miscalculates the importance of the intelligence police.
Who was actually in control at the time? Because people do believe, and there have been rumors that Mugabe was actually Senau, and she was in charge, or the military establishment was in charge. I think it was the military establishment in charge, because it's the only explanation that explains why. It's the only explanation that gives us why Mnangagwa came in. Because he had the military credentials, whereas Grace was...
No, he didn't have the military credentials. And that's why I say I think it's a conversation for another time.
Yeah.
I think that, first of all, I think the generals were quite reluctant to kick Robert Mugabe out.
Okay.
I think if Grace would have stepped away earlier, even a week or two earlier, I think they would have liked to keep it that way. But the expulsion of Emerson gave them a martyr, if you will, right? It gave somebody else so that the generals don't go in themselves directly. The question is whether or not they regret that, whether the generals feel like they should have just taken over. But like I said, Zimbabweans agonize a lot. And I don't remember Emerson Mnangagwa being anybody's favorite. But I also think sometimes people are just born with their own luck, right? And so maybe this was his own luck.
Right at the right time.
Yeah, like he was never, you wouldn't have imagined him to be a front runner. Mm-hmm. But because he's exiled and it's created this crisis, and now he looks like a good candidate. And Grace had assumed that because they had the secret police on their side, they would be fine, right? Because then they're making all the statements about the army must stay in the barracks, yada, yada, yada. And it's like, well, no. Your calculations are wrong. Grace should have been buddies with the military for her own sake. And they might not have put her in power, but they might have come up with some coalition to keep the president going and figure out a way to put Grace or another ally.
More long-term.
She miscalculated. And so then you end up with a coup that I guess a lot of people celebrated. I'm not of the school of thought that says people shouldn't have celebrated. I think that's asking people for a lot. I think I think we have to be gentle with people and realize that Mugabe's regime was so brutal and things were so difficult. And when there's an opportunity to hope, people will always choose hope. In hindsight, there is a saying in Zimbabwe about like celebrating the clown that's going to kill your parents. It's better when it's said in Shona, but I think
you can say it in Shona. I mean, our listeners will hear it.
It's fine. I'm actually not even sure about the correct phrasing.
All right.
But I think that's where we are.
Is it fair to say the hope from post Mugabe has died now? That this sort of expectation that things would be better. Some people were saying things were even better under Mugabe. From the statistics, you can see like Zimbabwe's economy actually improved quite rapidly from 2014, probably just pre-COVID years, or maybe somewhere around there. Like there was some sort of growth at a certain moment in the last decade.
I mean, there was. Remember, that's the period there where we're using the US dollar. And in 2016, the government decides that they're going to switch from US dollar to Zim dollar. And that, I think, so if you're looking at when you start to see the decline, that would be the decline, right? So imagine you've got your British pounds, you wake up and the government says you're now getting this random fake currency that technically doesn't quite exist, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what kills the economy almost immediately. Yeah.
So that's probably why some people associate the Mnangagwa years with sort of like a failed hope again.
Well, it's not just that. Things are bad. Things are really bad now. And there is no hope for things are going to get better.
So just to go back on the big episodes in the Mugabe years and trying to understand him, so you have a situation where he's feted by the Western world, perhaps even by the East, the global East, the Chinas, the Soviet Unions, because Mugabe was a Marxist, at least in theory. He's knighted. The guy was blushing when Princess Diana visited him in Zimbabwe, and
she visited my preschool. I gotta shout out that.
Oh, really? You've mingled with royalty then, in some way or another.
I guess we breathed the same air. Who knows?
Yeah. So the author of Dinner with Mugabe, Heidi Holland, she has spoke about this several times. That Mugabe is an anglophile.
He is.
So this is
But
very.
I actually don't understand why people use that as a negative about him. Remember, he is born and raised in a British system, right?
Yeah.
He's born and raised in a British colony. He is just as British as anybody who's born and raised in a British subject. My mother and I often talk about the shift of the passports. From a British subject passport to a Rhodesian passport and then to a Zimbabwean passport. He was a British person longer than he was a Zimbabwean.
That's a fascinating fact, actually. If you
It's
think
true.
about it,
And so I think like when I read her work, it's sort of like, well, they want to make it seem as though Black people were romanticizing this thing that didn't belong to them, right? And I think, well, no, actually, Britain belonged to them. Just as much as Zimbabwe belonged to them, English belonged to them. Those customs, that's what colonialism was, right? Colonialism,
like a product of both.
Exactly. So you're a product of both, but he really was. He was as British as you can be, being born outside Great Britain.
Right, so that's the end of the first part of this two-part episode. We're going to leave you with some voice notes from Zimbabweans, their opinions, as well as their lived experiences of Mugabe's Zimbabwe and the aftermath. Be sure to leave us a 5-star rating. Be sure to follow us, subscribe, check out our YouTube, check out all our platforms. Find your preferred platform and your preferred content, and let us know what you think.
So I spoke to my grandma regarding life under Mugabe's presidency and life after Mugabe was overthrown. My grandma is a wonderful woman. She has grown up and has spent her whole life in Zimbabwe and is a retired citizen there now. And she's 70 years old. We had a very interesting and eye-opening conversation because unlike myself, I was born in Zimbabwe but moved abroad, when I was quite young. I asked her what her thoughts were when Mugabe first came into presidency. She said that initially she was excited and felt like there was hope for Zimbabwe as a whole country because Mugabe was an educated man with a lot of strong political background. And I think this gave the nation, and particularly my grandma herself, speaking on her own experience, some reassurance. She even said she was excited. At first, the presidency of the country was great, but all of a sudden things took a turn for the worst. Her first memory of things changing was when the white Zimbabwean farmers were violently evicted from the country. From my understanding, I believe that the white farmers were providing jobs to the local community, to the local communities and stuff, and were allowing jobs and just a way for people to make a living for their families. But unfortunately, when they were evicted, it meant that these farms were then obviously restored to Zimbabwe as a whole, but jobs were then taken away. So in my grandma's memory, that's when things changed. She also said that towards the end of Mugabe's presidency, however, she thinks he was misunderstood. Mugabe was in power for many, many decades. And she believes that actually the acting president was his wife, Grace Mugabe. So that's her opinion. She thinks that, towards the end of his presidency, Mugabe was no longer in charge of the government or in charge of the country, as Grace Mugabe had maybe taken over. She believes that it's a shame because Zimbabwe has a lot of wealth and it should be able to provide jobs and security for its people, but there is lack of jobs, healthcare, and just some of the basic human needs that people need are not being met, which then forces people to go outside of the country to just be able to get a job, to be able to provide for their families. She said, word for word, Zimbabwe is a rich country with a lot of potential, but it seems like our government is not able to manage this ethically in a way that benefits its citizens. I believe that at the time when Mugabe was overthrown, she said that there was a glimpse of excitement and thrill that there's going to be a new Zimbabwe and that change was going to come. But soon after this happened, it was very clear to see that, you know, it's the same party that's in power since 1980. You know, ZANU-PF has always been in power, and not a lot has changed since then. And she says that some may even say that things are just taking a turn for worse.
My name is Nathan, and I'm a student at Wellesley College. So, my first question would be, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of Mugabe? To start with, I actually think Mugabe was of a hero to Zimbabwe. I would definitely describe him as a philosopher, a critical thinker, a father, and probably the hub of Pan-Africanism in Africa. Not many leaders shared the same vision as Mugabe. Mugabe spoke of black empowerment way back, and no one actually got to understand it. So I would call him the hub of Pan-Africanism. Tell us about your experience of life during and after Mugabe. Well, life has been a series of ups and downs for a fellow Zimbabwean living in Zimbabwe. I would think that before Mugabe's era, people had, you know, endless problems. The whole dispensation had its own, you know, like problems, a lot of them to list. But in 2008, Mugabe told the people that no one would want to be employed in 10 years from now. Look at right now. Everyone wants to start their own business. Everyone wants to employ someone. That is empowerment locally. They want to have something of their own. And I feel like that's the vision of every African. My third question would be, do you think Mugabe was misunderstood? Of course, Zimbabwe owed a bit of respect to Mugabe, actually. Mugabe was a visionarist, and having a vision without on development only is actually a problem for a country, because there's a difference between a project manager and a leader. That's one thing that Mugabe made clear, and I respect him for that. The current dispensation sees X to be more of a project management system. Yet Mugabe was a leader. You have to lead the people. You have to take out the people, lead everyone from whatever bondage they're in. That's what I feel like you need to do. Sanctions have been overthrown to Zimbabwe. That's a point to take. So probably the Western community have failed to understand Zimbabweans as a first port of call. But actually, them themselves as Zimbabweans. Zimbabwe is 42 years, and it's only 5 years since Mugabe was overthrown. What went through your mind when you heard Mugabe was overthrown, and what's your expectations to the new dispensation? I actually thought Mugabe's coup to say sense of relief to any fellow Zimbabwean. It's quite sad how locals or us Zimbabweans thought that Mugabe owed us success. They thought Zimbabwe was going to be better, or we thought Zimbabwe was going to be better. Freedom would translate to money. That's how we felt. But later on, let's not realize that the problem was actually not with Mugabe, but within the system. Because 5 or 3 months later, after Mugabe was overthrown, there was still no money in the banks. There was still no electricity. So, of course, I think, you know, we over-anticipated everything. We thought there was going to be change overnight, but, well, change does not come overnight. This has been damaged for over 42 years, and it takes time.